Good.
Well, I've entitled this lesson, I believe we're on lesson 9 in our study of apostolic founders and their communities. And this one, I think, is one of the most important, though every lesson seems important at the time, because I think these things are building one upon another as God's Spirit leads his people through the centuries. And so the apostolic communities and parroquias, we say in Spanish, or parroquiae, which were like confederations of what we would call apostolic communities, um, were important. And the works of the great Celtic founders and apostles is very important. And we need to learn from them and study them. And I think it's going to take a while to really absorb, because there's lots of material to be read and to be studied. Dr. Winter has pointed out that the Celtic movement is the longest continuous missions movement in church history. It seems to have lasted in its most powerful expression for 300 or 400 years, but up to 700 years, and maybe even if we take it up to the Reformation movement, there was a reform movement in the 12th century. I mean, we're talking 900 years. And statistically, the Irish, according to Dr. David Barrett, are still one of the major sending nations. I think he includes the Catholics, but they still have that wandering spirit that was so typical to the Celts. And one of the things that's important is their indigenous use of their own language. The Irish made extensive and significant use of the vernacular, Old Irish, known as Sean Gaeilge or Gaelic, and in various aspects of their culture and scholarship during the early medieval period. It was the first written vernacular in post-Roman Europe. The Irish were the earliest people in Europe to write in the vernacular since the fall of Rome, a significant fact, likely due to Ireland never being conquered by Rome, meaning their language was not supplanted or made inferior. And that's kind of one of the things that's been impressed on me in Costa Rica, as the Spanish language was made, and the people made the indigenous languages to be pagan and weird and evil. And so they were marginalizing the smaller indigenous languages. Seems to be a phenomenon, a human phenomenon. They held their own language in high esteem, as do my Kuna friends that have also maintained their culture and strong Christian movement down in Panama, the Kuna tribe, because they've held their own culture and language in high esteem. And it's meticulously linked to biblical stories in the Irish context. For some reason, my PowerPoint is not moving. Did it move?
No, it's still on the one that it was on.
It's bound up for some reason. I bet it's because my computer is getting full. I may have to jump out. I'm totally bound up here. Stop the share. That's never happened before. I'm going to have to offload a bunch of material because I've been downloading too much stuff.
Yeah.
And so my computer is
Right,
there.
there is
There it
No,
goes.
it's changed now, Randy.
So, in the area of literacy and scholarship, the Irish became very famous. Latin was the liturgical language and learned as a second language, but the Irish clerics produced some of the Western Europe's finest Latinists and simultaneously set out to write their own language, Old Irish, even producing treatises on grammar and vocabulary. And here's the key point, and I thought of you often as I was preparing this, Stephen. The monasteries became centers, learning centers of education and book copying, where Latin and Greek were taught to the common people. Now, I've wondered about Hebrew, and I see very little mention of their use of Hebrew. So it seems to be the classical languages of Latin, their own vernacular, and Greek. And I think that's an important thing because the Irish and the Celtic movement very much took the indigenous forms and structures and gave them a Christian direction. And that would be a good way of talking about contextualization without too much syncretism. And they just happened upon, because of their tribal structure, to a model where the head of the monastery, which we would call the apostolic community or the mission community, became the head of the church rather than the bishops. The bishops were under the abbot or the apostolic leadership, as we would call it. From a biblical standpoint, that's how I would analyze it. And the historians say that it's due to the tribal structure in the Irish culture.
Yeah.
Their missionary call and their reasoning, like ours was, and this comes out of John McNeill, the Irish Peregrini were fond of citing the example of Abraham. Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house to the land that I will show thee. So they followed this pattern literally, that they were to do as Abraham did. And that's kind of a biblical and logical thing, that we are to walk in the footsteps of our father Abraham, according to the Apostle Paul. So in McNeill's book, he's got some good maps of some of the primary monasteries. And here we're looking at a map of Northern Ireland. And some of the main ones, Derry, Bangor is very important because I believe it was Columbanus that was trained in Bangor, Armagh, Kells, where we have the famous Book of Kells, Douro, we have the Book of Douro, and I'm seeing Clonmacnoise show up time and again. So it's an important, but all of these dots on this map were monastic foundations, and all of them had their monastic founders. Sometimes O'Clonard is a famous one as well. And even places like Dublin were originally a monastic foundation, according to this map. And then here we get into Southern Ireland, where we have Kildare, and we have a woman founder. And that's another interesting thing about the Irish. We have these women monastic founders and even double monasteries. And then we have down here the famous Skellig Michael. I'd love to go on a trip and visit these places and visit the ruins in some of these places just as a trip. That would be a fun thing to do, Stephen, when we have our time coming over there to some of us to take a trip and visit some of the old monastic foundations.
Skellig Michael is way out. It's really. Have you seen the pictures of it?
I've seen the pictures of it.
Incredible place. I mean, it's way out.
Have you been there?
No, I've only seen it on the TV. But they were way out, and they lived in these little stone huts, and it was really
this was their application.
the wilderness.
This was their application of the Desert Fathers. They considered the ocean their desert.
Yeah.
They would go out on these islands, and that was their desert experience. And more I'm seeing that as these monks would go, the Irish monks would look for wilderness areas, but immediately their spirituality and their contact inevitably with local people would bring them fame, and then they would begin to educate, and the mission began to expand into an abbey and then to a training center, and before long we had this major operation that's going on. And then if we look at Scotland, we have up in the north, the two most famous are on the east is Iona, on the west is Iona, which was
on the east is Lindisfarne.
Yeah, and on the east is Lindisfarne.
Yeah.
Which was established by Aidan. And Iona was founded by Columba.
I've been to Lindisfarne. I haven't been to Iona.
I'd love to go to some of these places. And then down south, we have some of the major foundations, according to John McNeil, down in southern part of, I guess this is getting down into England. Yeah, Scotland, Welsh, and English. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Irish Peregrini were radical in every way. And one of the ways that they were radical, they had these 4 types of martyrdom. They called it the red martyrdom, which means dying for the cause of Christ. And it's interesting that it's pointed out that there was not a lot of red martyrdom that happened in the evangelization of Ireland, at least. I'm not so sure about how for Scotland. And then green martyrdom is living a life of extreme asceticism and self-denial. This often involved becoming a hermit, going out into the green wilderness and living in a skeet monastery. This was called green martyrdom. The island monasteries were practicing the ocean as a desert. So they were aware of the Desert Fathers, and so they were imitating the Desert Fathers by finding their own desert as the ocean islands. I mean, these islands were so barren, you wonder how they scraped a living out there other than fishing to survive out there. And then white martyrdom involved the nonviolent but deep sacrifice for God, including rejection of the world. And then lastly, the white martyrdom could come to the 4th level, which was auto-exile or self-exile. And that's why they became to be called the peregrinatio, or the peregrinos, or the peregrinis, because they would go on a pilgrimage and self-exile themselves in imitation of Abraham on a mission. So those were the 4 martyrdoms of the Irish or the Celtic spirituality. So they functioned from a committed community. Missionary activity flowed from a central monastery. Iona, Lindisfarne, Bangor. There was abbot leadership, not the bishop. And I love their literal imitation of Jesus and the 12 as they would go out in teams of 13 with their team leader, the abbot or the founder or the apostle, and their 12 assistants. So when some of these guys went out, like Columbanus, they were accompanied by some of their disciples, like Saint Gall or Galen. Saint Gall became a major founder in his own right when he was left in actually a place that I want to talk about later, very close to where my family had several hotels in Vorarlberg in Austria. And they had this aspect of their spirituality they called peregrinatio pro Christo. So they were on pilgrimage for Christ. Missionaries often left their homeland permanently for the sake of the gospel. This exile was seen as a spiritual discipline and imitation of Christ's journey, Christ's exodus, so to speak. Christ's exodus was, of course, a martyrdom, so they considered the peregrinatio a form of martyrdom. So we have examples of Columba from Ireland to Scotland and Columbanus from Ireland to Gaul and Italy. Of course, he died down in Bobbio, Italy. Maybe my favorite of all was Columbanus. The monastic schools and the scriptorium were a major part of their missional task. So they began to form large monastic schools that concentrated in the Midlands in the East Ulster. By the 11th century, scriptura spread west of the Shannon. The Shannon River was the central river flowing down the center of Ireland. And we have centers like Clonmacnoise, which keeps coming up over and over again in my study. Bangor, very important. Armagh, which I think was founded by St. Patrick. Douro, Kells, Clonard, and I couldn't find Terryglass, but it was mentioned by John McNeill. The monastic scriptoria were dependent on patronages and resources. In other words, the vellum was very expensive for their writing, so they needed patronage from the rich nobles. The claims of the monasteries expressed through the hagiographies and genealogies, including the genealogy of the saints. Their charters were drawn up to record land and gifts to the church. And it's interesting, their modus operandi was to ask the king or a local prince to give them land for their monastic foundation, but they would not go to the bishops. So they were getting permission from the kings, but they overlooked the bishops if there were any bishops around. And that began to create tension between the European continental bishops and the wild-haired, crazy Celts that were beginning to wander with their apostolic teams. So if we look at the early Scottish, Welsh, and English monastic, we see in Northumbria that Lindisfarne is up there in that area. Even there's Edinburgh. And so Aidan, and with the foundation of Lindisfarne, then they began to evangelized all down through Northumbria. And here's a beautiful reproduction of a scribe thought to be Saint Bede, who described the events of the Synod of Whitby in the early 8th century. And this is part of a 12th century manuscript. I love their artistic biblical illumination.
I lived in Whitby for 6 years, Randy.
You lived in Whitby?
Yeah, yes, I did.
Wow. I would love to visit some of those places. Probably if I come over there, I'm going to have to plan an extra 30 days or something to do a tour.
The trouble is these days,
you got to have money.
Well, if you go to Whitby, you won't see so much about the Synod of Whitby, but there'll be lots about Dracula.
Oh, brother.
Yeah, no, this is the way things are going. Yeah. It's very good for holidays and fishing this Whitby, but not for much else.
Wow.
The Abbey is still, there is the old Abbey still there. You can look around.
Well, I would do that and I would ignore the other stuff.
Yeah, I know.
Well, here's a list of some of the famous founders, kind of in chronological order. Patrick, who was an Englishman.
Yeah.
It's interesting how the whole thing starts with an Englishman who's carried away as a slave, but then it's the Irish Celts that in reverse are blessing the English. Saint Ninian, the founder of Candida Casa, which evangelized the southern Picts, and Saint Enda of Aran Islands on Inishmore or Aranmore. He's considered to be the father of Irish monasticism. Saint Finian of Clonard, very important because he's like the father of the 12 Irish apostles. And then we have these women founders like Saint Bridget of Kildare. And I'll get into the women founders later. And Comgall of Bangor. So it was Comgall who was the discipler of Columbanus and Saint Gall. And it was Saint Gall who left from Bangor. He wasn't born in Bangor, but he was trained there. Left on his journey from Bangor to go over to Brittany and over to France. And then we have Saint Columba or Columcille, who's a great founder, very important founder of Derry, Douro, Iona, and the mission to the Scots and the Picts. Any one of these guys, we could go into, with study, you could go into great detail and learn a lot of stuff because all of these guys were very, very amazing. And I love this Saint Brendan, the navigator. He would get into a boat, so the story goes, in one of the books that I read years ago, with 12 disciples, and they would put up their sail and they would pray, Lord, just take us to where your spirit wants us to go. And apparently there's rumors or legends that Brendan reached the New World at some point.
Yeah, that's what's believed to be the case in his leather boat.
Amazing. He's the founder of Clonfelt. So he was a founder as well, and just an apostolic navigator. And then there's Saint Columbanus, the apostle to France and Italy. So this is going up, starting in the late 4th century, and we're going through these first centuries. A lot of these greats came out in these first, up into the end of the 7th century, were the great names. Going into the 8th century, we see the Pellegrinis going out as educators because they're building upon what the earlier founders had done over in the continent and around England, Scotland, and Wales, and Ireland. And there's Aidan of Lindisfarne, very important. And this guy was little known, Saint Kilian, who became the apostle to Franconia, which is the northern part of Bavaria. And he was a martyr over there in Franconia. So all of these guys are amazing studies in their own right. So St. Patrick is considered to be the though not strictly a monastic founder, he was kind of like the evangelist and the apostle of Ireland. And they say that his name is correctly pronounced Patricius, at least in the Latin. It's Patrick.
Well, yeah, that would be a Latin one, wouldn't it?
Yeah, Patricius. In the English, it's Patrick. In the Gaelic, it's Padraig or Padrig in Welsh, or Petroc in Cornish. So he established churches and communities across Ireland, introducing the idea of bishops who often operated in conjunction with monasteries. His missionary work established a charism or spiritual climate, and I think this is important for the foundational work of Patrick, because that charism allowed the later monastic founders to flourish. His early monastic communities integrated contextualized Christian teaching with Celtic cultural practice, such as using the Celtic cross to symbolize the fusion of pagan and Christian tradition. Now, I have a different interpretation as you study, well, what did these Celtic crosses mean? I have a different interpretation that I got from a missionary who's now the director of the whole seminary there at Asbury, where my daughter studied in Kentucky. He's an expert and missionary to the Buddhists. That the cross, the Celtic cross, was the world under the cross. So you have the circle, which is symbolic of the world, and the cross. So the world is crucified to me and I to the world. I think it's a much more biblical interpretation of what the cross really means. But some say it's more the Chi-Rho. But I think it's a beautiful and much more biblical interpretation to see the circle as the world and the cross as the biblical verse from St. Paul in Galatians, that the world is crucified unto me and I unto the world. And it's a very beautiful symbol that we use in our training of our missionaries going to Buddhists, because the Buddhists have the circle or the wheel of samsara. So if we put the wheel to them always, the circle to them means the circle of the recycling of rebirth and reincarnation. So the cross is the victory and the end of that cycle in a Buddhist context. And then we have early figures like Saint Edna of Aran. And this guy, in spite of what Patrick did, he's considered to be the father of Irish monasticism. And he founded one of the first monasteries out on the Aran or the Aranmore Islands, establishing asceticism and communal living. And then one of the greats was Finian of Clonard, known as the teacher of Irish saints. he established the monastery of Clonard, which became a major training center and learning center for monks and missionaries. So each of these foundations became learning centers, and some were major learning centers where, the Irish dominated Latin. They became experts in Greek, and then they maintained their indigenous language. So I think they're a model for the fact that indigenous people should learn the dominant language, but we should preserve the language of the indigenous people as well. So here's the list of St. Finian's 12 apostles. And I'm not sure how much information we can find on all these guys, but he had these 12 Irish apostles, Caran of Sagir and Caran of Clonmacnoise. This is very famous, Caran of Clonmacnoise on the Shannon River. St. Brendan of Birr. I imagine one of these Brenadins is the same Brenadin that we were talking about earlier, but I'm not sure. St. Columba of Terryglass, and then you've got St. Columba or Columcille. So apparently there was a St. Columba that founded the Terryglass Monastery, but he's different from St. Columba or the Columcille Columba. And I think he's the one that established the monastery out on Iona. And we go down through all 12 of these Irish apostles who were disciples. And it's interesting, the name for Ireland, and I don't know if I've spelled it correctly there, the 12 Hibernian apostles.
Hibernian, yeah.
And it's interesting, the word Hibernian for Ireland, because as I studied the history of Celtic peoples, the Celts also came into Spain, and we call Spain Iberia.
Yeah.
So that you have this Iberian Celtic mix happening in Spain as well. So it's interesting that there's an overlap in the name Iberia with Hibernian for Ireland. And so then we get to the great Columbanus, and I want to go into a little more detail with Columbanus. And he trained up in Bangor under Palmgul. He was known as Columba the Lesser, and he worked between 540 and 543. He was born and died in 615 over in Bobbio, Italy. So that brings us then to, in Stephen McNeill's book, he associates the Paruciae, or the Celtic monastic confederations. He links it, at least the fame came with Columbanus. So the Celtic Paruciae was, and I think it's a model that we need to consider. In our organization, we visualized our bases being united in like a parucia, a federation, where each apostolic foundation or apostolic community is contextualized locally, but then are joined together in sort of a confederation. And this developed in Ireland was a distinctive ecclesiastical organization system that emerged during the early medieval period, particularly from the 6th century onwards. This model differed significantly from the urban-based diocesan system prevalent in many parts of Europe. So parruccia was a confederation or confederated connected monastic houses considered the province of authority of a single founder. So a founder would found a parruccia of monasteries, and then they would be confederated together. The principal abbot of the mother house. So this is really like an early version of orders. They didn't call them orders; they called them parrucci, but it was really an order established by a monastic founder or an apostolic founder. The principal abbot of the mother house exercised supreme authority over all monasteries and congregations within the parrucci, even over bishops who resided within their jurisdiction. And this was the unique feature, as bishops in the Irish system often had a more liturgical role, ordaining clergy, consecrating churches, rather than an administrative one. So Columbanus set sail with 12 companions from Bangor Monastery, where he was trained under, I put here Saint Combal, but it's Saint Comgall. That's an error there, I think. And here's the names of his 12 companions, the most famous of which was Gallus, or Saint Gall, who became in his own right a very famous founder. And they first went over to Cornwall, and then from Cornwall they landed in Saint Malo, Brittany, and then on to a place in Burgundy called Anagre. And there, with the permission of the Merovingian king Childebert II, he built his first monastery in Anagre. Very soon after that monastery, he built a second monastery over in Luxeuil. And in Luxeuil, there's a weak Christian community that had been kind of wiped out with different invasions. And so, with the permission of the king, again, he built that community, and that grew and became a hub, which amazingly enough spread to over 50 monasteries all over Northern Europe. And here's a picture of the distribution of those monasteries. Now, Columbanus didn't found all those, but they fanned out from the Luxeuil hub, which became a great hub of monastic education and training, as the Celtic missionaries and those trained locally were sent out all over the place. It's interesting that Columbanus preached a high doctrine of grace, and they had this doctrine of daily confessions of sins to an autumn chara. And the autumn chara in the Celtic or the Celtic tradition is comparable to what we would call a spiritual director. They called him autumn chara, means like a soulmate or a soul friend. We would call it a spiritual director today in Catholic lingo. And he also wrote his famous penitentials. The Irish were famous for their penitentials. And he would build hermitages associated with his monasteries, where they would go out on retreat. The problem with Columbanus is that he made a lot of friends with the locals, but made enemies with the bishops. And then he had this prophetic bent. So in the John the Baptist tradition, he criticized the king that gave him permission, and the king got angry. And actually, I think it was the queen. She was worried about criticizing his relationship to her, that she would lose her position. So he ended up being exiled from Luxeuil with a number of his monks. The king marched him clear over to Nantes. And so the bishops were angry with Columbanus, and the kings oftentimes became. And he even wrote letters to the popes and to the bishops, rebuking the bishops and rebuking popes. And in one of his letters that I found, he says this to the bishops: we are all joint members of one body, whether Franks, Britons, or Irish, or whatever people we come from. So Columbanus was advocating for unity of the body of Christ, and the bishops were trying to divide the body, and the apostle was trying to unify peoples, cultures, and languages together as one kingdom of God. Isn't that sound familiar? Doesn't that sound familiar?
Mm. Yeah.
And then later we find Boniface, who called the Peregrini, the wandering bishops, the Episcopi Bagantes. And a bagante in Spanish is like someone that's a wandering vagabonds. So he condemned in various 8th and 9th century councils, were undoubtedly Celtic monks who were condemned in these councils. And Boniface did not like them at all either, because they were in a non-diocesan Irish or British church. How do you pronounce that? Diocesan? Diocesan?
Diocesan, yeah.
Diocesan. They were regarded by Boniface and by the territorial bishops in the developing hierarchical structure as a serious menace to unity and order. Quite in the spirit of Boniface, the Council of Mainz, held in 813, denounced these intruders as monstrous creatures, acephalai, hyposenari similes, nec homines. They're not even humans. They're monsters. So this became quite a controversy. And I love these Irish and Celtic missionary teams. This drove the sedentary bishops crazy. Although the jurisdiction of Boniface was greatly enhanced by Gregory III in 732, he was made metropolitan of Germany east of the Rhine. He was not very successful in dealing with the intransient Celts. In a real sense, Boniface was the successor, this is from John McNeill, as he was the censor of the Celtic pioneers. He's the successor and the censor. The Celts had already awakened to a Christian culture. Most of those Germans whom he brought under hierarchical control. There is truth in the remark by Philip Schaff: he reaped the fruit of their labors and destroyed their further usefulness, which he might have secured by a liberal Christian policy. Interesting. So Columbanus, with this dangerous habit of rebuking kings, was thrown out of Luxeuil and marched over to Nantes. And so the story or the legend goes that in Nantes, they'd put him in prison and they were putting him on a ship. And a storm came the day they were to be shipped back to Ireland. And the captain was so taken by the storm that he thought this was a sign from God. And he turned the monks loose, and they left and started a new journey going around the area they come from and working down towards Lake Constance. So they set on a long journey to end up over in a place called Brigance on Lake Constance. Now, this was very important to me because as I was studying this place in Brigance, where he sets up his third foundation, is the capital of Vorarlberg. And as I was reading that word Vorarlberg, I began to remember Vorarlberg. Where have I heard that Vorarlberg? And I remembered my grandfather was from the village of Lustenau, and he would always say in Vorarlberg, am Rhein, on the lower Vorarlberg Rhine Valley, which serves as the border with the canton of St. Gallen. So they began to evangelize in Brigance, and several of the monks were martyred because the people did not like the Irish monks in their ministry. So they killed two of his monks. So he just, Columbanus decides that he's not going to stay there. But St. Gallen was feeling sick, and he asked permission to be left in the area. So St. Gallen moves from there over to and forms a hermitage, which became known as St. Gallen, and he became a famous apostle to the Swiss. Very, very important work done by Galen or Gall, who's the disciple of Columbanus, and who are both disciples of Comgall. So it's very possible that my own ancestors on my grandfather's side, who were Catholics, my grandmother was Lutheran. She was from Frankfurt am Main, and he was from Lustenau, and Lustenau is just right next to Brigance. But it's further up, closer to the mountains, and my family has a ski resort up there and two hotels that my grandfather's brother started, the Hotel Fascina and the Hotel Sperge. This St. Gallen becomes very important because the abbey and the learning center that he established is very, very important. Right up to today, the Abbey of St. Gallen and its library survives over in Switzerland. Here's a picture of the Abbey library. I mean, absolutely gorgeous. And that was started by St. Gallen, the Irish. So here's your example of a learning center that blossoms into a major cultural transformative thing for Switzerland and Europe. Amazing. So the Irish monks brought Irish, Greek, Latin learning back to Europe. And that's why we get the famous book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, because really they brought Latin and Latin learning back to Europe, classical learning, and created monastic learning centers wherever they founded a monastery. So they had this wonderful artistry, the art of their illuminated Bibles and literature, the literacy, the education of the children, the teaching of languages. Notably, I don't see the mention of Hebrew. And so I don't think they're getting into Hebrew at this time.
Randy, can I ask a question?
Yes, you may.
Do you think that may well be because early on, basically the Bible of the very early church was the Septuagint, and when Jerome translated the Bible into Latin from Hebrew, Saint Augustine wasn't very pleased about it. The very early church looked more to the Septuagint than to I mean, and of course back then they wouldn't have had the Masoretic the Masoretic text that we have. They might have had a Proto-Masoretic text, but certainly we don't know to what extent it was just the same. And really, the Bible of the really early church was the Septuagint.
Exactly, I totally agree.
I'm just asking whether this, that might explain why there wasn't so much Hebrew, but the Greek and the Latin was there.
Exactly, I think you're right on that, and I think that's an interesting point. For me, that was disappointing because I love the Hebrew, but I think that's probably the reason of what's going on.
Yeah.
And the Jews themselves like to poo-poo the Septuagint because the early church took advantage of it, even though they themselves were using the Septuagint. Yeah. But the church was so successful, the rabbis began to poo-poo the Septuagint, and I think that was part of the dynamic going on there as well.
But I think in place at times as well, the opposite happened. In other words, the Christians were not at times complained that the Jews had altered the Hebrew text because the Septuagint really bears witness to Christ in many areas, and that there early on there were accusations that the early scholars of the Hebrew text had gerrymandered with the Hebrew text to excise from it things that were very revealing of the Christian faith that could be interpreted strongly as pointing to the Christian faith.
And I think it backfired on them because that's precisely the Arabs found out that they had said that and began to put that in the Quran, that the Jews had changed the text. And that's one of the things that to this day Muslims use. Well, you guys have changed the text. That's why it doesn't agree with the Quran.
Yeah. Oh dear. But what? Yeah, but you see, and that's the interesting thing. They would become the Christians would be complaining that they changed the text,
and then the Arabs took
away from Christianity.
Then the Arabs took up that saying and began to use it against both the Jews and the Christians.
Yeah.
Well, these monasteries then began to function as hubs of cultural and civilization. So our vision in the apostolic communities that the apostolic community should become a seedbed and a catalyzing force for catalyzing a renaissance and an awakening of kingdom civilization, I think is very real, because we've already done that. And it takes mavericks like the Celts and like our group, crazy guys like Randy Sperger and Stephen Perks and Lester Gonzalez, people that are crazy enough to say, wait a minute, we need to think about this more. So J.O. Westward describes the monasteries as schools all the way from kindergarten to university, hospitals, hotels, publishing houses, libraries, law courts, art academies, and conservatories of music. They were houses of refuge, places of pilgrimage, marts for barter and exchange, centers for culture, social foci, newspaper offices and distilleries. A score of other public and practical things were they: garrison, granary, orphan asylum, frontier fort, post office, savings bank, and general store for surrounding agricultural districts. They were a seedbed of civilization, and the network of these Columbanos monasteries all over northern Europe that the Celts are establishing, as well as some of the other monks, are the network and foundation of Western civilization. And none of our idiots in the universities really teach this.
No, of course they don't. Can I ask, where is that from? A book of J.O. Westwood?
That is a quote from, and I neglected. It may be in the bottom of the PowerPoint. I will send that to you later.
Yeah, I'd like to know if where that comes from. That's a good. Yeah,
that is a fantastic quote. We carelessly imagine the early monasteries as charnel houses of cant and ritual. This is the typical Pentecostal and Protestant drone without studying history on these things, that they were going out and closing themselves in monasteries, when just the opposite is true of what really happened. Yes, in the beginning, some of them wanted to get off alone in imitation of the Desert Fathers, but it never worked out that way. Oh. Whereas they were the best oiled machines for the advancement of science, the living accelerators of human thinking, and the precedent of the University of Paris. Amazing, amazing quote. I will get you the reference on that.
Yes, thank you.
It may, and then I've got another quote here from Christopher Dawson. I'd like to get this book. Maybe you already have it.
I've read quite a lot of Christopher Dawson's books, and he's very well worth reading. I may have that. I'm not sure. I've read most of his books, but yes. Sorry, carry on.
Oh, you'll never believe where the quote comes from. It actually comes from an article in Chalcedon. It's an article that I found at Chalcedon on Ira. It takes monkish missionaries to save and make modern Europe.
Yeah, I've read this book recently. I think I have. You know, I got this book and I read it on my holidays. We stopped off on our way down to South Devon at a working Benedictine monastery in Devon, and on our way down we always stop off at this place. It's a great place to go and look around, and they've got a cafe, you can have your lunch there. They've got a pizzeria as well and all kinds of things, and they had a shop and there's second-hand book in there, and this was the one, The Making of Europe, and I got it. I read it.
Lucky you. I need to order a copy.
Yeah, I think that is still in print. I think you'll get it if you look up online. I think there's a.
It's now available on Amazon.
Yes, Christopher Dawson. I think there's a website as well dedicated to yes.
And the article in Chalcedon says it takes a monk to save and make modern Europe. I added the missionary part, and that's really the truth of it. It takes monkish missionaries to save and make modern Europe. I mean, what is a monkish missionary? He's a founder of apostolic communities. Referring to the works of the monks in the Middle Ages in his book, The Making of Europe, Dawson says, the greatest names of the age are the names of monks, Saint Benedict and Saint Gregory, the two Colombas, Bede, Boniface, Alcuin, and very interesting, we're going to see later, Alcuin was trained by the Celtic monasteries in Ireland or Scotland. I've got it later in my so Alcuin himself is trained by the Pellegrinis.
This is the Alcuin associated with the Charlemagne.
Yes.
He was a very important character. We owe a lot to what he did.
Well, he was formed and trained by the Irish Pellegrinis.
Yeah.
And a lot of these famous missionaries, English missionaries in the early days, were also formed in Ireland and Scotland. Yeah. Alcuin, Rabanus Maurus, Dunstan, and it is to the monks that the great cultural achievements of the age are due. Whether we look at the preservation of ancient culture, the conservation, the conversion of new peoples, or the formation of new centers of culture in Ireland and Northumbria and the Carolingian Empire. Amazing quotes. These are two amazing quotes. And I found these quotes in the article in Chalcedon.
Interesting.
In the late hours, like 2 a.m. last night. And so, Columbanus goes on an arduous journey over the Alps because several of his monks had been killed there in Vorarlberg, in Bregenz, the area where my family, possibly my own heritage on my grandfather's side in Austria, who was Catholic, came from, maybe from some of the work of Columbanus. He is now in his 60s and he's going into the territory of the Lombards, a barbarian tribe in Italy. He goes to Bobbio. And this is Saint Columbanus's 4th foundation over in Lombard, Italy. And he goes to the Lombardian king, King Agilulf, to negotiate land of an abandoned church in Bobbio. This is the 5th, not the 4th, the 5th and final foundation of Columbanus. He dies in Bobbio. Great, great apostolic founder, charismatic, prophetic, amazing apostle of the Lord, Columbanus, one of my favorites of the Irish Pellegrinis. And here's his monastery over there in Bobbio. To this day, it's now the abbey is now a school. And I'll send you a link to a video that sums up the life of Columbanus in a modern way that's very, very good.
There's a very interesting story about Alcuin and the Renaissance under Charlemagne, because at that time the Latin language in many places was breaking down and it was beginning to turn into what we today call the Romance languages, like Spanish and French and Italian and Romanian. And what was happening is that the Latin language wasn't being necessarily pronounced correct, and all kinds of strange things were happening. And now it's difficult to know with these stories just how true it is, but certainly the legend is that some monk baptized the whole tribe in nomine Patriae et Filiae et Spiritus Sancti, which means in the name of the Father, Land, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Of course, what he should have said, what he should have said is in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sanctus, in the name of the Father and the Son. But it's all to do with the endings, and the endings are beginning to break down and become these other languages. And Alcuin reformed the Latin language, and he gave us our system of Latin pronunciation in which every syllable was stressed. Every, there were no silent things and that kind of thing. Now, these days, people say, because it used to be so, well, we don't really know how the Latins really pronounced Latin. I think there are people today, researchers today, looking into this and are getting much closer to it than they used to. And that's one of the funny things. We know more about the past now than they did in the past, I mean, the relative past. But it's an interesting story. But that renaissance in learning was really important. And it was important preserving the Latin language, and so we could understand all these things that were written. But there was also the Renaissance under Alfred the Great in this country a little bit later.
Well, that's both of those guys are gonna come up in my talk later on.
That's important as well. Yeah,
when I get into education, the impact on education.
Yeah,
Alfred is going to come up, and Alcuin, and just amazing the impact in education.
Yeah, very important. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
And I would like to see our apostolic foundations really. Of course, we've always been involved with linguistics in missions, but to emphasize Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and the local indigenous languages, I think is very, very important. And that's one of the things we can learn from the Irish pedigree.
Yeah, I mean, we desperately need a renaissance of Christian learning.
Now, it's interesting that a secret plan to form the EU was hatched in a house in Luxeuil, France. And this guy, what was his name? Robert Schumann, who was the Catholic sort of ideologue behind the European Union. They hatched this plan to form the European Union in this house in Luxeuil in honor of Columbanus. It was a symbolic thing to have it in Luxeuil that had become the hub for the network of monasteries that unified Europe. And here's a quote from Schumann. Saint Columbanus willed and achieved spiritual union between the principal European countries of his time. He is the patron saint of all those who now seek to build a unified Europe. So these EU guys are using our guys to create their status paradise.
But you see, what's the thing is with this, Randy, it's gone wrong. I mean, the idea of building a united spiritual Europe based on the Christian faith is a great idea.
But it's not. But it's rejected the Christian faith.
Yes, what the modern EU has done is rejected Christianity altogether. And in the preamble to the EU document, they refused to put anything in it. They wrote Christianity out of it.
Well, they're just liars. They're liars.
But they were told about it, and a lot of people said there were a lot of things said. You cannot write about Europe without writing about the Christian faith and how it shaped Europe, and they refused because their ideology is thoroughly anti-Christian. And the idea of a united Christian Europe is a great idea, but that's not what we've got. What we've got is a united secular humanist, liberal, left-wing fascist Europe.
Well, it's going to follow down around their ears, and I think the Lord is going to use Islam to judge them.
It's already falling down around their ears.
And what's going to happen is that both Islam and humanist Europe is going to be re-evangelized by the Christian missionaries once again through the apostolic communities, that an awakened Christendom and awakened kingdom of God is going to begin to counterattack, so to speak. Hopefully.
Yeah.
So the Irish missionaries were inspired, motivated, and trained in the many English missionaries were inspired, motivated, and trained in Ireland.
Yeah.
And this brings out the whole point of missions mobilization was part of the work of the Irish apostolic communities. So these missionaries that are flowing out from Scotland and Britain, many of them were trained by the Irish Celtic monastic foundations and founders. John McNeill says, here I'm mixing my Spanish with my English, numerous English missionaries to continental German tribes were among those who got their higher education and probably their missionary purpose from a sojourn in Ireland. The Irish charism that starts with Patrick and through these great apostolic founders then is transmitted to these English missionaries. So the greatness of the Irish paruccie and peregrinis is amazing in its impact on European civilization and the whole world. And here's St. Kilian, who was a founder and martyr over there in Franconia, martyred near Würzburg, Germany. And there's a video on St. Kilian here, which we won't watch, but you can watch that later. And even St. Willibrord was trained, an English missionary, a supporter of Wilfrid, who was forced into banishment and spent 12 years in Irish monasteries. Interesting. He was banished and went over and spent 12 years in Irish monasteries. In 690, he went to Frisia with 11 companions. Note the model. He's going now as in the spirit of the Irish Peregrini, Willibrord, who's an English missionary with 11 companions. So there you have the model of the 12. His work was soon crowned with such success that at Pepin's nomination, he was made Archbishop of Utrecht. The flourishing monastery of Echternach in Luxembourg was his foundation, and there he died in 739. From its scriptorium came the celebrated Echternach Gospels, and there we have an image from the Echternach Gospels, companion manuscript to the Lindisfarne book. Willibrord supported the early work of St. Boniface, who was to leave a record of even greater achievement. In spite of the fact that St. Boniface has lost some esteem in my eyes of his treatment of the Irish Peregrini. I had him as a hero in the Perspectives course, but now he's lost a little bit of his shininess to me.
Has his halo been dinted a bit?
Excuse me?
His halo's got dinted.
Yep, his halo got dinted a bit, exactly. And then even over to the Slavs. In recent years, according to John McNeill, recent scholars have become aware that the Celtic monks played a pioneer role as missionaries in Slavic lands. Nearly a century before the supposed planting of Christianity, listen to this, in Moravia by Methodius and Cyril, unnamed Irish and British missionaries penetrated in some numbers into that kingdom. Amazing.
Mm.
So history needs to be rewritten here, not rewritten, corrected in some ways. And then we get into the feminine monastic founders and abbesses. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither bond nor free. There is neither male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So these crazy Irish have these women founders and monastic abbesses, even of double monasteries. So we get people like Saint Fancea, an abbess who converted her brother, Saint Edna, who became the father of Irish monasticism. So the whole ball of wax traces back to a woman abbess. Wow, that's amazing. And then we have the famous Saint Bridget, who founded Kildare, one of Ireland's most important double monasteries, housing both monks and nuns. Her leadership style reflected a mix of Christian and pre-Christian Celtic hospitality. Monasteries under her influence became centers of charity, art, and learning, known for her emphasis on community life, care for the poor, hospitality to travelers. Amazing. And Saint Ita, who died in 570, founded a nunnery in Kilidi. She is noted for keeping a school for young boys, including future monastic leaders like Saint Brendan of Clonfert. Of course, he becomes the navigator. So these women leaders are also, through the Irish and the Celtic charism, are transmitting and ministering to create great founders like Saint Brendan, who sought her counsel on significant matters. And then there's Saint Hilda, whose role as the abbess of Whitby in Northumbria. Whitby was a double monastery as well. So that's an interesting fact on Whitby. I don't know if you'd heard that of St. Hilda and the double monastery at Whitby. And then Eve first founded a monastery in Ebchester, then at what Bede refers to as Urbs Culdi. It is uncertain when these establishments were founded. Although Ebe first appears in records in the Lindisfarne by AD 642, the date of her brother's death. And then some of the other women, Trinihid, Ita, Saint Bathildis, and Saint Breca. So we need to do some study on these women founders and the work of the women in the Irish monastic movement, because a lot of this is news to me that came out in my study for this talk. So continuity and succession in leadership. In the 12th century, the continental diocesan structure and order began to dominate. And this is the beginning of the end of the greatness of the Irish and Celtic Peregrini movement. But that does give us 900 years before the Malachy of Armagh reforms, that begins to reform the movement more into the image of European ecclesiology and European thinking. Sad, sad, sad. Now, the Celtic villages or the Celtic villages, it's interesting how they were formed. And we see that the original, some of the original Celtic villages would have a circle in the center where the chieftain would live. Then the nobles would live around that circle. And then the farmers would live around in an outer circle. And that was the pre-Christian Celtic tribal structure. Now, when we come to the Christian, we have the same structure, but a new direction. So in the center circle is the church and the abbey, where maybe the abbot lived, the monks in the second circle, and the farmers in the outer circle. So we see similar structure maintained in Celtic tradition, but a new direction is given as Christianity and the kingdom of God begins to change the direction and flow of civilization. So we see the abbot in the inner circle, and the church, the monks in the second circle, etc. Now let's finish with Celtic monastic education. And here I think there's some important things that we can learn from their indigenous system of education. As schools of learning, the monasteries must have had a more than accidental relation to the well-developed colleges of pre-Christian Ireland, in which druids, bards, and brehons were judges, underwent exacting courses of instruction. In the Druidic schools, the successful complete a 12-year period of disciplined study, earned the rank or degree of olam, signalizing the highest attainment in learning. This is in the pre-Christian phase. The instruction was oral, and of its content, only traces are left in the heroic tales, poems, and law tracts. In Ireland, as not in Britain and Gaul, the Druidic culture was never destroyed by force. While Druidism as a religion yielded to Christianity, bards and brehons continued to function. The bards were numerous and influential through early monastic times, and some of the saints were their pupils. After his adaptation to the monastic life, Saint Columba went for instruction to the bard Gemon and resided for a time with him in Leicester. Late in his life, he championed the cause of Irish bards when their guild was under attack. So this is another model of indigenous contextualization and Christianization, probably with not a whole lot of syncretism, it seems to me, because of the power of these apostolic founders and their miracles and their just powerful ministry. The whole society was transformed. But that didn't mean it was tabula rasa with the whole culture. Children and new recruits, the monastery was obliged to provide instruction to children of the Tuath, and 1 in 7 of the young men is to become a recruit to the monastery. That was the rule. The latter provision was hardly requisite in the early period, when the monastic urge was sufficient to bring voluntary recruits in embarrassing numbers. The young men were flooding to these places to receive training, to become part of this wonderful new Christian civilization. And here's an interesting thing that I'd like to study more. Clonmacnoise, the world's oldest university, according to this book by Brendan K. Cobbett. Clonmacnoise was founded by Ciaran in January 545. It was plundered many times and was finally sacked by British troops in 1552. It had existed as an institution of learning for 1,007 years and is the Methuselah of universities, according to this book. This needs to be explored and researched more, because maybe the Irish Celtic Peregrinis were also the true founders of the modern university.
Have you read this book, Randy?
No, I haven't. I found it and in my research for this talk, and I'd like to get the book. So that's why I'm putting it with a question mark, because I don't know how well researched it is, but it could be true. So we need to do more.
You just found it online?
I did. I want to get the book. Like I said, this talk has opened up so many lines of research and study that are so important to apostolic communities that I think we need to really talk about some of these things. And Clonmacnoise in the center of Ireland, here's the cross. That was the Clonmacnoise is where this oldest university in the Irish and Celtic tradition as an institution of learning 1,007 years. The cross there is called the Cross of Scriptures, and that's part of the ruins of the monastery.
Who founded this? Sorry, this
Clonmacnoise. I've looked it up, and I've forgotten at this point. I had it written down somewhere.
It's all right, don't worry.
Now, here's the Irish Peregrinis in Charlemagne's court. This is the article that I found on that. The biographer Einhard tells us that Charlemagne loved the Peregrini, amabat peregrinos. And this is equally true of his father, Pepin the Short, and of his successors in the 9th century. No longer making their homes in the forest, the incomers now frequented the courts of kings. So we're seeing a change as we go into the 8th century. They're becoming proponents of education and culture. The founding stage was the 2 centuries or 3 centuries before the 8th century. They frequented the courts of kings and emperors who appreciated the help they could render in raising their people to a higher level of Christian culture. So they're the producers of Christian civilization and culture in Europe. It was, however, an English and not an Irish scholar whom Charlemagne made the first head of his palace school at Aachen, Aix-la-Chapelle, from 781 to 796, Alcuin of York. But where was Alcuin of York trained? Apparently in Clonmacnoise. Wow. Here's the linkage. And what are we seeing? We're seeing faith and worldview cultivates the garden, and I put this in Spanish, the garden of national culture. Alcuin had profited by the instruction of Irish scholars at York. The Irishman Colchu, to whom Alcuin wrote in 790 with the deference due to an eminent teacher, has sometimes been identified with the celebrated abbot of Clonmacnoise, founded by, there it is, Saint Ciaran. Saint Ciaran was one of the 12 Irish apostles of that name who was perhaps still living. Such an identification would bring the inference that Alcuin had studied in that monastery. Wow. So indeed, that's evidence that it's true what this guy is saying about Clonmacnoise. The church in York, England was founded by Celtic missionaries. Its schoolmaster, Alcuin, who may have been trained at Clonmacnoise in Ireland, introduced the late Roman liberal arts curriculum at the school. When Charlemagne wanted to set up an educational system for the continent, he asked York to send Alcuin as the best scholar in Europe to come to direct the program. Through Alcuin, the liberal arts became the foundation of European education. Albinus and Clement Britons trained in Irish scholarship. From the monk of St. Gall, presumably Nocter Balbulus, who wrote the Gesta Coli Magni, the deeds of Charlemagne, we learned that Clement came to Frankland with another Scot, here called Albinus, in the company of some Britons who had wares to sell. What are the wares that they're selling? The two introduced themselves as merchants of wisdom by calling out to groups of people, if anyone desires wisdom, we have it to sell. They were brought into the presence of Charlemagne, who inquired the price of their wisdom. Their answer was suitable places and ready students, and food and clothing, without which our peregrination cannot be carried on. Amazing. In the spirit of the Irish peregrini, and in the service of King Alfred, there's an interesting incident dated a century later and recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, is more certainly historical. Here we learn that in the year 891, 3 Irishmen, wishing for the love of God to be in foreign lands, they cared not where, crossed the sea to Cornwall in a coracle without oars and found their way to the court of King Alfred. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle gives their names but fails to inform us of their later service to Alfred in his revival of learning or in the conversion of the Danes in England. Amazing. And then we go on briefly. I'll just go through this very quickly because we're almost 11 o'clock. An expression of their rigorous ascetic spirituality and the love of beauty, the Celtic arts and poetry. And we haven't even talked about the Celtic love of nature or the Celtic love of nature. I'm sorry about that Celtic thing that
no, don't worry about it. Just carry on.
I'm used to saying the word in Spanish.
Yeah.
So they have crosses and architectural marvels and illuminated biblical art that's just so lovely. And I wanted to just make a statement on the Celtic crosses that I mentioned earlier. You know, the Chi Rho,
yeah,
is apparently the reason for the Celtic cross in one interpretation. Or was it really an artistic rendering of Galatians 6:14? But God forbid that I should glory save in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by whom the world is crucified unto me, and I unto the world. I think it's one of the most beautiful crosses that expresses Galatians 6:14. And it just sounds so Irish to say that. On the east side of the crosses, these big stone crosses, was the second coming in glory and figures representing the last judgment. And on the west side of the stone crosses was the crucifixion. Their panels on the crosses featured diverse scenes from the Old and New Testaments, such as Adam and Eve, and Cain and Abel, and David and Goliath, Saul and Jonathan, Moses at the rock, etc., etc. The Ruthwell cross, for example, portrays Mary Magdalene at Jesus' feet, John the Baptist carrying the symbolic lamb, Christ and the beasts in the wilderness, and the Annunciation. So the art on these stone crosses is absolutely marvelous. And then I have my application of the Celtic cross as a symbol of the victory of the cross over the wheel of samsara, which is the wheel of Buddhist karmic cycles, of almost eternal karmic cycles, when we can say, I am crucified to the cycle of samsara, and samsara to me, dead to it by the cross of Christ. As an application of our missionaries in Buddhist lands, I think it would be a wonderful way to preach the cross against the Buddhist karmic cycle. Then we have the famous book of Daros, the book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels, the book of Duro is an illuminated manuscript gospel dated to 700 that contains the Vulgate Latin text of the 4 Gospels. Amazing. There's a picture of the book of Duro. It has the famous eagle of the Gospel of John. And then the book of Kells, the 9th century, absolutely gorgeous. The book of Kells, Christ enthroned in the book of Kells, and the Lindisfarne Gospels as well. I forget what this says. Maybe I wrote it here. No, I didn't write it. I was going to write down what that says, but which was interesting. I've forgotten. And then they had these mini scriptures or pocket scriptures. The Book of Mulling from 650, portable books for priests and missionaries. The Book of Dima, another portable book. That's from the Gospel of John. And the Stowe Missal. And then we have the scripture manuscripts from St. Gall, the St. Gall Gospel book. So these, even up on the continent, the Irish Peregrinis that came and joined St. Gall did these beautiful manuscript illuminations that we have today in the manuscripts of St. Gall. That's it for today.
Okay, thank you, Randy. That's very interesting.
Fantastic theme, no? The Celtic.
Yeah, I think there needs to be more known about the Celtic Church and its missionaries and missionary monks. I have a question I'd like to ask you. I know there were married monks, and there were even married monks at times in the Catholic Church, but maybe not as many. But am I right in thinking that there were celibacy wasn't always a required part of the Celtic monks and monasteries?
That's my impression.
The interesting thing is that, and this is very difficult to find out what's going on. Certainly, Bede, I think, was in a double monastery, and that doesn't mean they were living together as man and wife. They had a monastery and a male and a female monastery on the same site, but separated. Yet in two places, the Venerable Bede says that he was married.
Wow.
And
wow.
he some have claimed, oh, well, no, he was just making a point, because in one place he says, I could have done far more if I hadn't have had to look after my wife. Now, some have said, well, this is he's just trying to make a point. He wasn't really married. But the problem is, in another document, he talks about having had a wife whom he possessed formerly in carnally, or in his lust, but latterly in purity. Now, it's difficult to know for sure what he's just talking about there, but he is saying he was married in two different places. And this is very difficult. If you try to read up on Bede, that this is not mentioned. They don't talk about this, and I'm not sure what it means, but certainly my understanding was that it was more common amongst the Celtic missionary monks and monasteries than it was in the Catholic, but wasn't unknown early on in the Catholic Church either. I just wondered if you had anything to say about that.
Well, you remember my comment, when was it, last week? Or we were talking about the impact of simony, and that the investiture controversy somewhere around that time.
Yeah.
And they were trying to eliminate simony, and to eliminate simony, then they started the business with the requirement of celibacy. So what date was that? So that's well after some of these Irish monks are.
Absolutely.
So I think that there were a lot more married monks and priests than maybe the Catholics have wanted us to believe.
And probably things were passed down through the family, things that maybe shouldn't have been. This is what the Simon is.
Well, that's exactly. I limited a slide because I didn't want to get into the discussion on simony, but because of the Celtic tribal structure, a lot of the abbots, and this is an indication of marriage, were passing down their a battle leadership to their sons through natural inheritance. And I think that is a danger, and that was a danger even in biblical days.
Yeah.
It's a human problem.
It is.
But that doesn't mean that it's wrong for my son to take that position if he was called of God to do it. And
yes. It's when it becomes it's not about calling and ability, but just effectively nepotism.
Mm-hmm.
But
so I think that would be a clue to the answer to your question.
Yeah.
So I would suggest probably that there was a lot more married monks in the Celtic movement than.
Yeah. Interesting, isn't it? Things that get left out of history.
I think this John McNeil's book is a good starting point, but it's old, and I think there's more information coming out. So I think I want to get some more material and do some more study, because I think that we have a lot to learn. In fact, in the constitution of HIMF, our organization, we actually include the Celtic movement as one of the models that we seek to imitate.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, I may look up this book on Clonmacnoise. I don't know how you pronounce that.
Clonmacnoise, yes, Clonmacnoise.
That looks very interesting.
Well, let me know if you find it, because I want to get a copy too, and I want to get a copy of. I will send you the copy that I have of the book on the history and the writings of Columbanus, because I think you'd be very interested in his epistles to the bishops and the Pope, because the guy was really a prophet, and he did not speak with
like that. The
he
bishops
did
were
not
like,
speak with hairs in his tongue, as we say in Spanish.
oh. I will look for that Clon MacNice, but sometimes some of these difficult books to get are horrendously expensive online. But I will look. The question is whether there'll be some kind of PDF or something like that. But I'll have a look anyway. Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation, Randy. That was really good. Very, very informative. Very interesting. I would like to find out much more about this subject.
Well, I'm very satisfied with the course. Though we don't have a big audience, I think that we're plowing ground for the future with some of Lester's work and your future work and my work. That we're plowing ground for the future and for future training. So I said to myself, if no one comes, I'm going to still give this talk, because I think it's that important.
Yeah. So, but the next one will be in 2 weeks' time.
Correct.
Yeah.
And you are in charge, right?
I will be doing. Let me say, there'll be reading for that. The reading is the chapter, and I think it's on the website. The chapter of my book. The book's called The Political Economy of a Christian Society. There's an appendix called Max Weber and the Protestant Doctrine of the Calling.
Can you put that up on the chat for the course?
Do you mean the Telegram chat?
The Telegram chat.
Yes, yeah. I will do that. And also the little booklet, Disciple the Nations.
Okay, the whole book?
Well, if you don't have time to read the whole book, just the second part.
Well, I've already read it once, but...
All right, well, then just read the second part. I mean, if you've read it, you maybe don't need to read it again. I will briefly go through, but I want there to be plenty of time for discussion as well. Well, that's if there are people here to discuss.
Well, that'll be a good... a very fruitful time based on everything that we've set up to now, and hearing your analysis from Weber and your discipling book. That'll be hopefully a very fruitful time.
Good.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Lord bless you.
I'm going to stop the recording now.
Yep.